I think what's really fascinating about this story is there is something about swimming that's unique from all other sports. So if you give up your interest in swimming for basketball, you give up a lot of opportunities. Yeah, you may not go to the NBA, but how many players go to the NBA? And I think Eddie Kirk and Leon Geis, who are here from Dusable High School, can attest to this, that what you learn from swimming may be more important than any other academic subject that you could learn. Here in Florida, we have a high drowning rate. You know how to swim, you don't drown. You can't say that about any other sport. You can't swim, you shouldn't be going out on the water. The planet's 2/3 covered with water. There's 21 other recognized recreational activities that you can do to keep yourself healthy the rest of your life after your competitive career is over in whatever sport you do, from scuba diving, surfing, snorkeling. I know Ed is still scuba diving, I believe. Ed, you still scuba diving, or did you give that up recently? Okay, but it did. But there's just so many other activities, and then you look at special forces, you look at anything in the marine industry. Here in Fort Lauderdale, we've got millions of jobs that require, well, not millions, but we've got many, many jobs that require the ability to swim, to work in the marine industry, to work on boats, to work on anything. This is not something you can do with just basketball or football or even math or science. So there's an old story that probably comes from Africa about the ferrymen and the scholars, and there was a guy that lived by the river that took people across as a ferryman. And he's got these three really intelligent guys coming along, and they start making fun of him. And one guy says, "What do you know about astronomy?" He says, "I know nothing about astronomy. I'm just a poor ferryman." And they say, "Well, geez, you don't know about astronomy. 1/3 of your life is lost. What do you know about algebra?" "Well, like I told you, my life is the river. I know how to swim, and I know how to take this boat to intelligent guys like you to get across the river." And they look at each other in disbelief and say, "Oh, without knowing algebra, 2/3 of your life is lost." So a big knocks over the boat, and as the two guys are struggling and the ferryman's swimming over to get his paddle, he yells over, "Hey, scholars, what do you know about swimming?" Well, and then as they drown, he says, "Well, for one of swimming, all of their life was lost." So swimming is really unique and distinct. And what's really amazing, I wish you'd all been here for Kevin Dawson's presentations, because when Bob said, here's a part of history that's recovered, the part of history that's been lost is that after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europeans and white people did not swim until the beginning of the 20th century, the last half of the 19th century. But it was acknowledged in everything that was written up until at least the Civil War that Africans, African Americans, descendants of the African people, and Native Americans were by far the best swimmers on the earth. And this is a story that when you take a look at what has happened through the prism of our culture, to change that now, and I think Kevin once told me that estimate, you can't tell for sure, but if there was going to be an estimate about pre-Civil War swimming abilities, 80% of black people in the United States could swim, and 20% of whites, and now it's completely reversed. So it's looking at how did this happen, and how can we change this to make swimming universal. Up in our other museum, we have an art collection that surpasses any in the world, but what it shows is that swimming was once an absolutely universal sport, and how it's been lost by one group of people and picked up by other people is kind of cyclical. Europeans probably swam, particularly the Romans. They were crazy about swimming, and there's a lot of reasons why that changed when the church came in and saw that the swimming and the activities that went on in the baths were immoral and disreputable and licentious and everything else, if you know your Roman history. So swimming, nudity, sex, all those things that were associated with the baths were deemed sinful. So it was really, you could be prosecuted. I think Kevin brought up the other day, in Africa they had trial by ordeal, and if you could swim across a river, that proved you were innocent. In the Western world, up during the Middle Ages, the trial by ordeal was that if a woman was thrown in and accused of witchcraft or anything else like that and actually swam, that proved that the devil was holding up and she'd be convicted of whatever charge she was. So these are amazing aspects, and Kevin's stuff is really fantastic. But what we want to do is, here at the Swimming Hall of Fame, we notice that there is this great untold story, perhaps in many ways the most incredible untold story in our Western history about this thing of swimming. And it's spiritual, it's everything, immersion in the water. From ancient days in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, in the Indians, all Aboriginal people associated swimming and the water with health. And we know that from scientific studies today, that people that go in the water live longer and healthier and everything, just like the ancient Africans, the ancient American Indians, the ancient Greeks and Romans knew. So in our museum here, we have sculptures and awards that recognize the European swimmers, the South American swimmers, swimmers from Asia. We have the European Swimming Award, and of course we have many that recognize swimming here in America and diving. But there's nothing there from Africa, and I think for many years we've been focused on the achievements of swimming in the Olympic Games rather than making everybody a swimmer, which is the mission of the Swimming Hall of Fame. So at this point, I sat down, I met a guy, a local artist, who is really an incredible guy, named George Gatson, and we sat down and we started talking about what we need is a sculpture that represents the achievements and contributions that Africans have made, and the descendants of the Africans that have come to America, in the world and achievement of swimming. And George and I sat down, we started talking, I took him through the museum, I shared with him all Kevin's information about the history of swimming in Africa and here in the Americas. And George, would you please come up and we'll have an unveiling of this sculpture. But you can describe all, take it off. And actually, I'd like to ask Eddie Kirk and Leon Geis, as members of the Dusable High School team, to come up here and help us show this sculpture, which will be awarded. The first recipients of this award and this recognition will be the members of the representatives of the Dusable High School team. So if I can get one of you guys on each side, we'll just lift this off. So Leon, you come over here. A swimmer and a diver, and you know that right now we're having the world's best divers around here competing. So I hope you get a chance to go see what these guys are doing today. So when we count to 3, if you guys would just showcase this. 1, 2, 3. I'll take this. And what this, whoops, sorry about that, George. What this says is this sculpture, commissioned by the International Swimming Hall of Fame, is dedicated to the memory, achievements, and contributions of swimmers of African descent to the history and development of swimming around the world. George Gatson, artist, May 11th, 2012.
I'd like to take this time to, first of all, say to Bruce, thank you, Bruce, for the opportunity, and kudos to you in understanding the importance that people of African descent have to play with the history of swimming. Bruce approached me about a year ago at an event, and he came to me and he said, George, do you know that Africans are considered the best swimmers? And I said, well, no. And I say that because I'm from a small town here in Florida. Population now is about 5,999. Growing up as a child, I almost drowned. I grew up in the era where segregation existed. We could not swim in the pools where whites would swim. So hence we actually swim in phosphate pits from man-made lakes, if you will. So when he asked me about doing this sculpture, it had a real significant meaning to me because of my experience. Of course, since that time, I do know how to swim, and as you were talking about the divers, actually, when I was 35 years old, I took a Windjammer sailboat cruise, took 5 actually, but my first, I got certified as a diver, and in Beckwith, I went 60 feet on my first dive. So this really means a lot to me, just being able to do that. But I want to explain to you what you see here in terms of images, because after researching and getting the story of African swimmers and how they were great swimmers and diving for pearls, I wanted to kind of put all this together, and if you could just bear with me, I'm going to turn this around. It's fairly heavy, so that you can understand the story that this sculpture tells. Here is the African mother putting her child in the water. the child grows and becomes a swimmer, and you'll see the swimmer here, the swimmer that actually dives for the pearls. The swimmer eventually emerges from the water with the oysters, the pearls in his hand, giving it to the Sankofa bird. Now the Sankofa bird in the African culture, particularly in Ghana, the Sankofa bird typically is seen with its head turned to the side, looking back, and an egg in its mouth. Well, I wanted to show that looking back in the past is really what this signifies, the past history of African swimmers. So hence, the bird looks back in the past to learn from the past and also prepare for the future. So now we fast forward to the future and we see Anthony Nesty. This is representing Anthony Nesty, who was the first person of African descent to win a gold medal in the Olympics. So the history is told of the strength of African swimmers from the beginning of childhood up through now. Today we celebrate men and women of African descent who have gained notoriety, and I'm honored to be standing with such individuals here today, such great swimmers who, fast forward in the future, we now can tell our children that the myth of black people can't swim is definitely not true.
Amen.
And we have dispelled it, disproved it, and thank you, Bruce, again, and the International Swimming Hall of Fame for this opportunity.
All right.
And thank you, George. I really think that this captures. No, stay up here because we're going to now give this to you. You guys are going to. No, I won't risk it. We had. I was the third guy who wrecked their back carrying this out of the car. George being the first. But I think what's really important is to tell the story, and George does it. And here on this side, that side has the North America, where the Africans were brought over to North American continent, and down here is Africa. And what is unique, and Kevin told this, and this was a universal story, that why the Africans were such great swimmers, and this was for 400 plus years. It was absolutely acknowledged, and the only people that did anything in swimming and diving for pearls to 90 feet underwater, holding their breath and coming up and doing that type of stuff, which is unheard of, is because the mothers took their babies down to the water and acclimated them to the water very early. And today, this is not what's happening in the African American community. And the mothers were always the keys. So they've got to get the kids down in the water, get them used to the water, and then be swimmers. And it's not important they become the next Olympic champion like Anthony Nesty, but if that's what one wants to do, they can do it. There's nothing to hold them back. And so that's why this is important. And when we look at the history of swimming, you'll see this swimmer here doing the crawl stroke. This crawl stroke didn't exist until 1901, when an Australian by the name of Richard Cavell imitated a South Sea Islander doing it, and then he discovered the crawl stroke. But this was something that we have images, and Kevin is back there, he's got descriptions, verbal descriptions, but we actually have an image of African swimmers doing a crawl stroke in the 1800s. So this was not something that it's like Columbus discovering America and Europeans discovering how to swim. Actually, the observations of swimming in Africa and Native America are probably what rekindled an interest in swimming among the Europeans, not the other way around. So it was the Africans that lived by the beach, not the white people, not the Europeans. That didn't come until the latter half of the 19th century. And then to the exclusion of African Americans. And that's where this cultural history that George has depicted here so well has been lost. And now how do we recover that? And it's hopefully by telling this story. And it's not just getting Olympic gold medals. It's getting people out in the water being active. Getting back to what every culture probably once did, was a connection to the water, which covers 2/3 of the planet. And I think, Ed, if I can turn this over to you for a little bit, because I know just to say a few words, I think if anybody has, I think whether it was Coach Mackey or your experience at Washington Park, I think from talking to you, I think water has been such a huge part of your life and you love it.
Can you just say a little bit about Thank you, Bruce. But, well, swimming has been 3/4 of my life, and it got me up to this point where I am now. And I'm still working with kids and coaching, and I still have a lot of fun out of it. Sometimes it's a headache, but it's part of life. But I really appreciate being here today, and also my family and my wife. It's really a blessing to have them here and to see this and to experience some of the things that was presented in some of the pictures and some of the old things, like my buddy here, guys. And we did a lot of things together, and I guess we'll always remember that. Let guys say a few words.
Well, actually, I don't know what to say because this is all new to me. I came down here to meet my old friend and have a bite to eat and talk about the good old days. I can't remember too much, but I'm still here. So I guess there's something. And I thank you all for coming down. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you guys for coming down, and I know that the Dusable High School will be the first recipient, and the name will be on here when we install it out here in the museum. So know that you are a great part of history of the International Swimming Hall of Fame, and are representatives of a great African and African American tradition in history of world swimming. So thank you. Well, that's the end of our luncheon. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you want to stay around, I think am I the next speaker?
Yeah. And then
Well, if you're at all interested in seeing how we changed the white population from non-swimmers to swimmers, and why the African Americans and other minorities had that swimming tradition excluded, that's the topic of my conversation.